Hello, kindred explorers of the ancient mysteries. This is Govin here with TeutonicShamanism.com. A really contentious topic within the world of heathenry, or what I'm going to refer in this video and actually ongoingly on my channel, if you haven't noticed, as the Teutonic traditions. So just to kind of recap for anyone that doesn't know, Teutonic means the peoples of the Teutons, which was a very broad term for the Germanic tribes or the heathens or the Norse tribes, although that is a little more specific to Scandinavia. Basically the ethno group that was North, Central, and Western European going back many millennia. So what's so contentious is that within modern day resurgences of the practices and ideals held by our ancient ancestors is that there's this split, or was a split, in the late part of last century between the Universalists and the Folkish heathens, or Teutonic practitioners. And it's actually better to think of it more of a spectrum. You have two polar opposites, and then you also have a lot of people in the middle who consider themselves Tribalists. Now, basically, the Universalists are really self-explanatory in the name. They are open to anyone attending and practicing the traditions that they practice. So if there's certain groups that congregate together in communities, if they're Universalists, they're open to anyone, no matter what race, no matter what sexual orientation, no matter what political ideology. You basically have this Universalist approach of anything goes, and the exact polar extreme is on the Folkish side of things. And the term Folkish really originates through the revival of Germanic paganism that was occurring at the beginning of last century. That obviously has its connotations and associations with Germany, First and Second World War. But it was happening much earlier than that as well. And the fact that there was that end result doesn't delegitimize what was happening there, because the peoples were being oppressed by external groups of varying types. And this was their method of bringing people together to actually preserve their traditions and uplift themselves, which is a wonderful thing. And throughout the last century, it seems that the only people that are stopped from doing that have been people of Teutonic origin. The Celts are allowed to have their ethnic tradition and identify that way without any cultural scorn from other people. The Native Americans are allowed to do the same. Peoples from the South Americas are allowed to do the same. People from India, from Africa, from various parts of Asia are allowed to do the same. Why are Teutonic peoples shamed for having an ethnic identity? That, obviously you might be able to tell I side more with the Folkish side of this whole dynamic. Now, the Tribalists being somewhere in between, there's a lot of variety of what could be in between, or what could be seen as that. So if you had a group that was getting together in some sort of ritualistic worship, they may be open to someone coming who was married to someone of a not Teutonic race or didn't have Teutonic blood in them. So it's appreciating the cultural and background context while being open to other people. Kind of, I'd almost describe tribalism similar in that respect to Judaism, where it's pretty strict on who can join a Jewish congregation. But it's not impossible for the Goyim to join in and become part of God's chosen people. You'd have to either become a Shegetz or a Shiksa to, become married to someone who's Jewish, and then you become Jewish through attending their Jewish synagogue with them. Or there are processes without marrying in some sects of Judaism. I don't believe Orthodoxy allows that, but some parts of Jewish religion allows that. If you have enough interest and you show the study and the pursuit of it over many years, you'll eventually be allowed to convert. So yeah, there can be even looser forms of tribalism within heathenry. But again, we're going to be talking more about the two extremes in this video. You could also say within Folkishness, there's subsections that are very, very specific. You might have purely Anglo-Saxon Folkishness or purely Norse Folkishness. You really only see that in areas where there is a high concentration of people that all do that. So, for example, where I live, there's just such a few scatterings of us interested in it, we all come together. We're all partly Teutonic or entirely Teutonic who are taking part in what we do, but it's not recognized as strictly Nordic or strictly Frisian or strictly Anglo-Saxon, etc. By and large, it's mostly open to all Teutonic peoples when you can talk about folkish heathen groups. The other side of that is also sometimes there's a political edge to this. So there's a lot of Odinist or heathen or Asatru groups that blend in the political side to it, whether it's not necessarily in their actual ritualistic practices, but it could be such a big topic of discussion that happens with the group that people that would go in not expecting that are somewhat taken aback, and it tends to almost always be more of the conservative type of stance, if not far right conservative on a number of things. And that's also when you get into the areas of sexual orientation, things like that, and what the Universalists call intolerance, if not bigotry, if not racism, within Folkish groups. And actually, in preparing for this video, I was reading a lot of articles from the Universalist perspective, and most of them seem pretty good in terms of actually acknowledging that it's not everyone that's Folkish is racist and not everyone that's Folkish is bigoted, etc. They were specifically talking about people they knew who didn't have that, but just held this idea for the spiritual side of things. And really, when you get to the bottom of those words, they don't hold that much meaning when you consider most people take a stance on something, whether they're pro or against something. I'm not talking just about these things, but just anything in general. People are pretty logical. I think we don't give enough people credit for being logical in their approach. So if you're approaching something and you're saying, I don't agree with this, whether it's a lifestyle or what have you, if your reasoning is based in logic, it doesn't mean it's correct. But if you think it's logical, that's not hate by you saying, I don't want to associate with people like that. Because if I say, people who do this type of drug, I think it's a self-destructive drug, I don't want to associate with those people, it's not because I hate those people. It's because I have an understanding that people who do that drug have various personality faults or what have you. And I'm opening myself up to various risks to their personality by associating with them. So if someone feels that way about anything that I was mentioning, they actually have a reasoning behind it. If it was pure, unadulterated hate, irrational, just emotional bias, yeah, absolutely, the label racist and bigot fits. But in most cases, most people have a reasoning behind their stance. And again, that's not to say it's right or wrong. I'm just giving the context for the argument of applying a label like that, which is a common label used to dismiss people, actually by Universalists who dismiss the stance of Folkish heathens. That's what I see. It's used a lot by people who aren't within the Teutonic community to dismiss the stance and ideas of Folkish heathens as well. So I'm by no means going to be able to tackle each and every point that has ever been made out there. I'm pretty new to some of this stuff as well, so I'm going to do the best of my ability to cover some of the major ones I've seen. And maybe I'll do an updated video at some point in the future if I come across more. So what it seems to be the biggest thing that gets mentioned as being something that the Universalists use to say, look at this is in the mythology, we must be open to anyone joining and practicing our cultural traditions that extend back to pre-Christianity. And that's the argument that the Aesir and the Vanir, which are two distinct groups of deities within the Norse traditions, the Teutonic traditions, that they were constantly at war with each other, and then they exchanged hostages, and then they became peaceful towards each other because they had each other's hostages, and they're basically kind of one pantheon of deities now, although they're still, actually, this kind of goes against it, you still kind of recognize a difference between the two of the deities that exist among the main pantheon of Aesir. So the Aesir include Odin, Thor, Frigg, Heimdall, and many others. The Vanir within them, Njord and his children Freyr and Freya, they are seen, amongst the Asgardian gods, or the Aesir, to be, part of the main pantheon. And you hear a lot less of the Vanir and the Aesir that were sent to live with the Vanir. But there are people that actually venerate the Vanir more than the Aesir. So, this is by no means an argument that these two groups merged and became one pantheon of deities, because people still kind of focus on one or the other in most cases. So even if you're okay using mythology as an argument for an open doors policy on your hearth or your tribal group gatherings, it doesn't quite add up to the arguments and stances that the gods allowed, anyone to just waltz into their area and become one of them. Because they didn't. They're a distinct, group. And that being said, we're not like Christians that have literal interpretations of the Bible. We're not using mythology to, directly replicate in the real world what it is we do. The gods were seen as gods, not as idealized humans. There was a lot of characteristics you might want to take on and strive to emulate, but they weren't replicas of humans that you wanted to directly emulate every single detail. Just like in the Bible, their lives of the characters weren't perfect, and a lot of the things that are described in the myths are, by all accords, lessons that you share to improve your life, but it's not about doing that. It's about learning what they did and changing your own life accordingly, and there's no set, rigid dogma of how you have to do that. That also being said, there's a third interpretation of the myths, that they are once the stories of our ancestors. We are direct descendants from these gods and goddesses. And if that's the case, then the Aesir and the Vanir, as two different groups, were very close to each other. And if they were warring against each other and they exchanged hostages, then these were two groups that evolved over time very close together. And if you think about the past in history, within any geographical region, the genetic makeup of those groups are going to be so similar, you can't even call them different sub-races. You can't call them even different phenotypes. So if we talk about humanity and then three major races, and then within those races you have a lot of sub-races. And people who try to argue that race doesn't exist, we're not going to do that in this video. That's ridiculous. That's just a way of classifying groups by broad characteristic types. Yes, there's always going to be people at the edges of these groups that defy the norm. We're talking about the averages within different groups. So if you break Europeans into 6 groups based on cultural and phenotypical appearances and things like that, if the Aesir and Vanir at one point were 2 groups that were at war with each other, they were almost certainly both Teutonic. If they weren't both Teutonic, one was, and another one was in a correspondingly neighboring sub-racial group within Europe, they were still highly similar genetically. And take Slavic cultural traditions and compare it to Teutonic cultural traditions, very similar mythology, almost near identical mythology, similar appearances, similar genetic background. So if we're going to use that interpretation of the myth, the one of the myths are literal people from our ancestral past with these tales that morphed into our mythology at that time, well then that doesn't work, because the so-called race-mixing gods were just neighboring tribes that exchanged people, which tribes already did throughout the world, because that's how you strengthen ties and alliances between tribal groups. There's nothing within that is against what sort of folkish heathens are describing as what would be an ideal to uphold within this spiritual tradition. Now, the other example Universalists attempt to use to give credence to their open door policies is the idea that the giants intermingled with the Aesir as well. Thor, it's well known that he's half giant, half god, but so are all the other gods. There's actually not a whole heck of a lot of information on who Buri was, the first god. I'm not going to go over the whole creation myth, but the first god is Buri. He had a son named Bor, B-O-R, not B-O-A-R, and Bor had 3 sons with a giantess, and that's Odin, Vili, and Ve. So Odin, the Allfather, sort of the most famous god. He's not the first god, but he's the most famous in some regards, or maybe Thor is in terms of the pop culture effect that has popularized Thor. But the Allfather, the sort of most prestigious god, is half giant himself. So that makes Thor 3/4 giant, actually. and Odin fathered several of the gods. Some of the gods, I'm not 100% certain where they came from. I'm not going into that for this video. But you can always look into that. I mean, these are, again, mythologies. Why are we trying to take mythology and base it purely as a literal translation? If we, again, go to that idea that the mythologies are based on our ancient ancestors, maybe there was an old race of giants that humans in our past interacted with, and the benefits were fine with them intermingling, and it doesn't mean that the giants were coming in and practicing what the gods practiced. It just meant that their genetic lines got mixed. Some people say the giants actually represent the Neanderthals, and they're giants in the sense that they had bigger bones. Weren't necessarily taller. In fact, I think they were shorter, but they were stockier and stronger, and that kind of lends the idea that maybe that's where Thor got his strength from. That's a very sort of scientific, evolutionary, almost atheistic perspective on the creation myths and the deity myths of Norse mythology or Teutonic mythology. But even if we go with the literal idea of there's gods out there and there's giants out there, we can't apply the same ideas of humans onto the gods. Sometimes the giants are even described as almost like metaphors for unconscious, basic drives. They often are shown in the myths as being very sort of dim-witted and passion-driven. They, eat humans. Thor's a defender of humanity against the giants from just, devouring them. Not all of them, but some of them are like that. So how you can extrapolate this idea that some of the gods are mixed giant, mixed god, and then that somehow means that our Teutonic ancestors would have been open to anyone of any race and creed coming into their lands and joining their religious traditions doesn't make sense. Now, something that's actually an argument for Folkishness is that our ancestors may have been maybe somewhat universalistic. I don't think it was anywhere to the degree that you see of the extreme Universalists, but say they were, that might have actually gotten their culture wiped out. Obviously the people are still around, but that's how Christianity may have infiltrated the northern tribes, the pagan tribes. One theory, which is a very strong one, is that the kings of different groups were converted, and therefore the people that are under the king's rulership convert over time. But the other idea is that, pagan traditions within Europe were very open to, because they were pantheistic, they were open to other gods from neighboring cultures being integrated and influencing theirs. It's just another statue on the altar. And one idea is that Jesus came along and he was actually seen as a war god within Europe. There's evidence that Jesus was a war god before he was this benevolent healer, all dressed in white. He was seen as someone that martyred himself. And so if he was on the altar next to, Odin, Thor, and these others, eventually, he just kind of replaced them all, because you get more and more Christians that would have come into the land and were accepted because they, had a special liking for that one god, and it basically crowded out the others over time. So an argument for Folkishness, especially if you're a heathen that feels strongly about the effect that Christians have had on the wiping out of those cultural roots and the history that was there and the lore that was there, some of which is obviously lost, some of which was preserved. Some was preserved by Christians, which we can be thankful for, but it would have been nice to have just had that culture remain. Like ancient Indian culture, modern Indian Hinduism has its roots in a timeless tradition that's unbroken. So the fact that the tradition was broken could be said to have been because of this slight apathy around having rigid barriers saying this is our ethnic identity. So that's an argument for Folkishness in my view. The fact that it was a tradition that got broken. If it had had a stronger identity within the people and that they embraced it, that's how cultures and traditions persist. Now, ethno-religions, which are almost always pagan pantheistic religions, have existed all over the planet. In fact, I think pretty much every pagan tradition that exists, every shamanistic tradition that exists, has that ethnic part to it. And it's easier for people in modern sort of academic left-wing thinking to look at that and say, oh, everyone from the past is racist. No, it's part of people's identity. In some respects, it's better to have that because then you don't have people pushing their identity spiritually onto other groups. It's only the monotheistic religions that, are post-polytheistic that often ended up being warlike or conquesting in the sense that they wanted to install their religion on other people. Islam, Christianity, to a lesser extent Judaism, but there's still, within all three, a fairly pervasive racist ideology to the extent that they want to suppress and kill off other groups. There's obviously warring that went on between tribal groups, pre-monotheism, but it wasn't to the extent that we saw in imperialist culture that rose up and had, religions converge into monotheistic sort of super states. So yeah, it's actually my argument that ethno-religious practices are more peaceful because, yes, it encourages people to become tribalistic and be more group-oriented, and yeah, they're less likely to help someone outside of the group than someone within their own group, but that doesn't mean they're completely against it. It just means that people within your group come first. Just like you're more likely to help someone in your family that's going through a hard time than you are someone living down the street. It doesn't mean you hate the person living down the street. It's just that you have priority over your family over someone one concentric circle further outside yourself. And just the same, you're more likely to take care of that person within that larger concentric circle who's your neighbor than you are someone 2 cities over in that second concentric circle, and so on and so forth. I've seen people with the Universalist mindset try to point this out and try and create an argument against this, so I'm just going to read this excerpt from one site. Others argue that since some other traditional cultures are skeptical of Europeans who want to be part of their spiritual community, for example, Native American groups, therefore it is appropriate for heathenry to have the same attitude. Of course, European descended peoples have not been the victims of centuries of systematic genocide at the hands of Native Americans, so the equivalency of the two cases seems doubtful. If we want to talk about racism, I don't know the background of the person that wrote this, but it could simply be towards themselves if they're white. Come on. You're actually going to make that argument that people are only allowed to be exclusionary if they've been oppressed? Where's the logic in that? This is the tired old idea within left-leaning political arenas, socio-commentary, where they have created this new idea of racism as being only something that can happen when an oppressing group is doing to an oppressed group. It doesn't work in the opposite direction. Really, the only qualifying factor for what's racist, and this is the most agreed upon definition, is disliking someone irrationally for their ethnic or racial identity. So trying to say people just because they're part of a group that was oppressive in the past, therefore they're not allowed to have an ethnic identity-based religion, that's fucking racist. Like, that fits the definition of, creating this qualifying thing that only applies to one group. It's pretty incredible people actually come up with that kind of rhetoric. Now, if we were to talk about the Native Americans, indigenous Americans, they, certainly do have a skeptical view of white people that want to join in their powwows and things. There's certainly some groups that are more open to it, and that could be seen as more tribal, but you pretty much never see someone who has no native ancestry performing or participating in the actual dance. They might be on the periphery observing, and that is certainly acceptable and makes sense. People want to see what other people do as part of their culture. It's interesting, and there can be value gleaned from that. But yeah, anyone of any group would feel uncomfortable seeing a white person in the mix of various Native Americans doing their spiritual practices that are on display. Yes, there's definitely Métis, as we call them in Canada, or half native, half white, or quarter native, etc., down the line, types peoples who look very white. And so they participate and would likely participate in a more in-depth way, but they have that native blood in them. So there might be a time and place, many years in the future when Asatru, when Odinists, and all these other heathen groups, Teutonic people, resurgent cultural groups, get to a point where they're so large and they have such clearly defined ways that they do things, that you might have other groups coming and observing what's going on. And that could be totally valid. I'm sure Folkish groups would have no problem with that. I think what's happening right now, there's still this resurgence, this rebuilding of these cultural identities. So people are vulnerable. They're, in most cases, very small groups of people getting together to practice these ancient ways. It's one thing seeing someone joining and observing and perhaps participating, but who's to say how far along they become in terms of being a part of that? Are they going to get to the point of wanting to lead things? Does it feel weird having someone of a different racial group teaching you or instructing you on how to do something because they have more experience, but you might be clearly of the group racially and ethnically that identifies as Teutonic? Let's just change the ethnic identity up. If you have some sort of emotional knee-jerk reaction to what I've just said here, I just want you to consider this. And if you have a different reaction to what I'm saying, when we switch the groups up, you're less triggered, then you might actually be racist because you're having a different set of qualifying standards for a different group than for Europeans. So, yeah, imagine, Native Americans were just having a resurgence of their traditions after them being wiped away for, almost a millennia, in many cases just hundreds of years. And you had a disconnect between different groups of indigenous peoples, of, Universalists and maybe the equivalent of Folkishness. And say with one of the Universalist groups, there was a European that came along and got really involved in their practice, their tradition, because it was totally open to anyone, background, ancestry, and all that doesn't matter. If someone was practicing it and they become so proficient and well learned in that, is it appropriate for them to, take on a leadership role? Is it appropriate for them to be teaching other people about that tradition if they're not native themselves? We just think about that and it just seems weird. And I wouldn't be comfortable, progressing in any other tradition and pretending I can teach people that tradition. It's different when you're talking about other parts of a culture. If I go to India and I practice yoga to the point where I'm very proficient in the skills of yoga or the skills of tabla drumming, there's nothing weird about teaching other people those things. But I wouldn't go become a Hindu priest and expect in 20 years to be teaching other Hindus. Might happen, but I'd feel weird, and I know Hindus would feel weird who are learning from a white Westerner. One little random thing I wanted to insert was that in popular media there's been some talk of this one example and trying to say that it somehow makes the point of Universalists that it was totally open doors and open season on anyone coming in and practicing the Norse traditions. In the show Vikings, you had this one monk that was brought back on one of the raids to England, brought back to Norway, or a region that is today Norway, and they brought him in and sort of adopted him as part of their tribe for a bit, and he got along. He started venerating their gods. He still had Jesus in the back of his mind, but he liked the Norse traditions. And they actually showed some tension between him and other peoples because he was different, etc. But this is not some amazing example of diverse traditions intermingling. He was Anglo-Saxon. He was taken from an Anglo-Saxon monastery. He's a real historical figure, first of all. Anglo-Saxons are Teutonic peoples. A couple centuries earlier, his ancestors would have been venerating Woden instead of Odin in Norway. So, there's not really an argument there because he has that blood in him. He has that tradition, that and appearance so similar as well. He was maybe a little smaller because he wasn't a warrior, he was a monk. So he looked a little more frail than the Vikings around him. But, this is an argument for this. There was the tales and written accounts of Vikings and other peoples from Scandinavia going around on raids or on trade routes and coming back with people from those areas. There's little bits of Native American blood in Iceland. And you can find little genetic traces from other eras that the Vikings went to and then came back and brought sometimes people back with them. These are really, really, really tiny percentages in terms of additions to the population, in terms of people integrating. They don't create any big change. And yeah, that's going to happen anyways when you have like a shipwreck off some coast and people wash ashore, can't get home. They join some tribe and learn the language, etc. They become part of a tribe. Things are different now that we have the ease to travel the world, and there's this tension of where do we go in terms of, preserving our own traditions and culture as well as actually interact with other cultures. People have a hard time kind of working this out in their mind, and people want to be seen as moral, thus they go to the extreme of, it is best to allow yourself to mix with everyone and open borders no matter what type of people are coming in, whatever their cultural traditions they're bringing in. You do this and you subject the host group to change. Whether it's a host country taking on a culture that has drastically different values that then starts to shift the society to that direction, or if we're just talking about spiritual traditions, you open people to another type of people to come into your tradition. Those people coming in have different values, both culturally, but also there's actually proof that about 50% of your personality is heritable. So if there's broad characteristics associated with racial groups, by bringing those people into your culture, whether it's religious or spiritual or not, you're going to have it change. That's undeniable. They don't have the same way of being, and that's not a bad thing. They're different. They're not inferior and they're not superior, but you have to acknowledge that it's going to change your tradition. So one of the last things, and this is going back sort of to the written accounts of stuff, this is written on Varg Vikernes' blog. This is by no means a categorization that was strict in the sense that they wanted to apply it worldwide or that we should apply it in any way like a caste system, but it was a description of a caste system based on race. And what it says is Odin actually sends Heimdall to Earth to create a better human race. His first attempt is called the Thrall, which are people who are black and ugly and stupid, and that's not necessarily referring to the black race. That could simply mean the association with being dirty. And Heimdall pays no attention to them and keeps trying. The next result is the Carl, or Freeman, who had reddish brown hair and is tall and strong, and sort of these are the typical warriors. And the third group is called the Jarl, and they have the fair-eyed, intelligent, beautiful, and light complexion. And if we think about this in the context of, the Teutonic peoples, perhaps this was a caste system within the Teutonic peoples. Perhaps there was a racial element there. We don't know. But it does talk about that beginning group as being different. So yeah, it's a more contentious part of mythology. But people don't want to look at that. It exists there. What are we to interpret it as? I don't know. I'm not trying to make a conclusionary interpretation of it, but, it's there. So again, that doesn't need to mean anything outside of the fact that our Teutonic ancestors had an awareness of race, possibly, in that context. They obviously traded. So this is really what I think is the defining quality between Folkishness and Universalists, is that on the Folkish side of things, people are just embracing what is they are as an identity. And in that spiritual context, if you want to have a certain degree of exclusivity towards your group, it's just like having, a family dinner at, some holiday. You might have your own family and your grandparents. Maybe sometimes you have some extended family. You might choose certain people from your community to join you as well who may not have a family. But, you don't have an open door to anyone to just come in and join your Thanksgiving dinner that's walking by in your neighborhood. Likewise, having some qualifications for your group to remain an ethnically based tradition, there's nothing inherently hateful about that. There's nothing inherently wrong about that. And in fact, it helps preserve the tradition in my view as well. Religion within European culture, which has mostly been Christianity for the more recent past, has played a very key role in helping to build up and preserve the family unit. And to do that, there's had to have been various values that have become associated with Christianity. And some people argue that those didn't exist before Christianity pervaded Europe. But we do see a lot of those values having been in Europe beforehand, as a matter of fact. I'm not going to get into a long explanation, discussion of that today. The idea within Teutonic traditions, or the perception of it, is that a lot of heathens are more conservative. And that's simply because they realize what it takes to build a tradition that has the qualities that is going to be successful. They are a lot of similar qualities that exists within Christianity. Pagans, in the more loose term, paganism would encompass heathenry or Teutonic traditions, but pagans are more seen as sort of like the Wiccans and the, in some cases the Celtic sort of recreation type traditions. They're often seen as just like these hippies who, use drugs, have orgies and whatnot, and probably sometimes live in communes. These are not sustainable to building strong community bonds, strong tribal bonds, and actually having those traditions go on within a, definable context. So there are different strategies. If Universalist heathens end up going that same way, which kind of looks like they do already, that's what they're choosing to do. No one can really argue with that. There'll still be ongoing fights between these groups, but I don't think there needs to be fighting. People do what people do. It's like, on my own, what I do as a personal practice spiritually is different from what I'm going to do in a group context. In the group context, it has a much more defined order of doing things, but because I have a history of various practices, and I was far more eclectic than I used to be, but I'm less eclectic now. But still, I have certain things I do, and I'm not going to carry that over to the group situation. And the same can be said if there's other groups that do different things. They don't have to meet some rigid guideline that applies to everyone. So I'm actually really open to the idea of Universalists existing out there. It's kind of like an ongoing experiment. We'll see how they do with having that open doors policy. But what I don't like is the attacks Folkishness gets from both Universalists as well as people in general who are of that sort of leftist, extreme multiculturalist mindset. Because multiculturalism leads to monoculturalism. It's the blending and loss of culture. And anyone that tries to disagree with that, we already see the end result of that in various parts of the world. Okay, again, big topics. We'll do that another day. But let me know what you think about this video in the comments below. We don't need any long tirades of people throwing out labels because you happen to disagree. But if you do disagree or agree, I want to hear what you have to say based in, reasoned, calm, polite conversation. So leave that below. And look into this topic if you're also unfamiliar with it. There's lots of articles written online from both viewpoints. And with that, I'll talk to you again soon. May your gods, allies, and ancestors be with you.